I'm Bob Bustance. I joined the Gordon Craig Theatre in 1984 as the arts administrator, and I looked after the theatre, programming it and all the activities around it for 25 years, retiring in 2009.
Hi, my name's Trish. I worked at the Gordon Craig Theatre from September 1996 to October 2007. I started as a part-time front of house manager and then working over the years became operations manager when I left in 2007.
My vision for the theatre back in 1984 was to really open it up to a much greater number or a much greater slice of the community than it had been perhaps in its first decade of existence. I mean, the work that had been done there was very good, but I felt that it was very limited in its appeal. I think I'm right in saying in 1984-5 we were looking at running for about 25 performances. It might have been as many as 30, but it certainly wasn't any more. By the time I left and still to the current day, you're looking at running 100 performances of pantomime at the Craig. It is still one of the longest running pantomimes in the United Kingdom. And it returns a sizable amount of income into the theatre.
Because the theatre is only 506 seats, we needed to do a lot of performances to get the return on the revenue. So they would do long performances, and the longest one was Bradley Walsh, 112 performances of Jack and the Beanstalk. But as it was his second year, so it sold out. But on average, it was about 95 performances that we would do, starting last weekend in November, maybe the first weekend in December, and going through towards the end of January. So for that time, that was the bubble you lived in. We all worked together, we all ate together, we went out for dinner together, we celebrated in Chicago's and did various other fun things. Great atmosphere, real family theatre, really there for something for everybody. With amateur theatre, they put on some absolutely wonderful productions, and the work that they put into it was phenomenal. They always had an audience because obviously they all have family and friends that live locally. So that obviously was wonderful to see. The cost of putting on those productions, the risks that they took, but the courage that they had to do such wonderful shows.
Often, if an amateur company goes into a professional theatre, they're basically told they can't use this, they can't use that, they can only go into certain areas. This was never the case with amateur companies at the Gordon Craig Theatre. They are allowed to come in, use all of the equipment, yes, under supervision, and there were certain elements of the theatre that could only be operated and used by the professional staff. But those professional staff were provided to the amateur companies as part of the subsidised hire. So they had the use of all sorts of facilities that they could probably only have dreamt on prior to the Gordon Craig Theatre being built.
Sherma Batson, who was one of the councillors in Stevenage, came up with and spoke to me about running Celebrate. Celebrate was to be held in October, which is Black History Awareness Month. And so we used to put on a show every October that she spearheaded and was the force to be reckoned with for that show. And it brought together lots of black performers, and she always managed to get somebody, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, I can't think what his name was now, but he came along and hosted the evening for her. The butler from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, that's it. It's just a wonderful celebration of sort of black history and an awareness of ethnic groups performing, and it was always such a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Yes, the English Sinfonia first came to the theatre as part of the orchestral concert seasons that we were running with funding, in particular, from the Eastern Orchestral Board. It was really out of the business relationship I had with the orchestra that led us into increasing their appearances in the season, and they were interested in working more with local groups as well. So the Eastern Orchestral Board and the local authority all got involved, and we looked at the possibilities of the orchestra actually relocating to Stevenage, and in particular to taking over some offices that were vacant in the theatre itself. And this is what happened. So it was with funding from the Eastern Orchestral Board, funding from the local authority, and the fact that we as a theatre were very happy to have them in the building, and in return for their office space they ran certain programmes with local groups and so on, and that's how the English Sinfonia came to really be resident in the theatre. As a result of their residency in the theatre, we then created around them in the spring and autumn orchestral season. So you had a whole season of concerts by the orchestra that were particularly aimed at Stevenage audiences, that were designed to dovetail together so that we could sell the whole season. People bought season tickets. It was all a very exciting time that this should happen in the theatre, really, that orchestra should have the Craig as its home, and it very much became part of the work that we did.
The Gordon Craig Theatre for the town is an absolute gem, and I think for the town, the size that Stevenage was when it was built, it is a real asset and still is. It's a 506-seat theatre. One of the nice things about the theatre is it has lots of lovely leg room. It was built as a producing house originally, and so it has a very large scenery dock, rehearsal room behind the stage area that a lot of people don't see. It also houses a very old CHRISTIE theatre organ, which was always something that people came to see and enjoyed the organ concerts or before films that were shown at the theatre.
It was a very fine instrument, and a lot of money was spent on restoring it, so it was actually an instrument in top-class condition. The nature of the instrument also was that it was, although it was primarily a cinema organ, which meant that it had lots of effects of the sort that you would have used when accompanying silent films back in the days of yore, but it also had what they call a good classical sound. So we were also able to use the organ in some orchestral concerts that specifically with organ pieces written specifically for organ pieces, so church organ type music. So that was good. I think the thing that amused me most of all about having the organ was that I decided to use the organ as it would have been, or at least in part as it would have been, in its heyday in the cinema in Liverpool, in that the theatre programmed quite a few cinema performances during the course of the year, and therefore, because we had the hydraulic orchestra pit lift which sat in front of the screen, I used to actually program the organ in before the film show. So if you came to watch a film at the Gordon Craig Theatre, the organist would be playing, and as the credits came up on the screen, as the title credits came up on the screen, the cinema screen, then the organ would disappear down into the depths, as I say, as it would have done all those years before. And I actually found that quite fascinating, quite amusing, and it was a great addition to the theatre. Well, the Saturday morning children's shows, or the Saturday morning club as it was known, was already a very important part of the theatre's programme when I started in '84, and it had been running, as far as I am aware, right from the start of the theatre opening back in the mid-'70s. So it had a history of 10 years. We were very fortunate that it was led by a local celebrity, a guy called Jack Mays, who was a children's entertainer and much more. He was also a member of the Magic Circle. He was a magician. He was very much an adult entertainer as well, but he had a ventriloquist act. And Hairy Harry was the first introduction to theatre for a lot of young people in Stevenage from the mid-70s right up until the early 1990s. I mean, in that space of time, of course, there were vast changes going on in the entertainment business generally, I mean, both inside and out of the theatre. It was taken over in many ways by the digital, or not even the digital age, pre-digital, but the TV age, in that the audiences started to be taken away because they were staying at home looking at the television. They were also, the format was taken on by a lot of the cinemas, because in that same period we were looking at the development of multi-screen cinema complexes. So instead of being your sort of standard one-screen cinema that was open in the evenings or whatever with a matinee of the film, that was all changing to virtually 15, 16 hour a day cinema, and the Saturday morning cinema clubs were springing up, and all of these were taking over the work that was being done by the live theatre. I mean, it was very important for the theatre because it was not only the weekly show. People joined this club. They got birthday cards from Hairy Harry. This was all administered by the theatre. So there was a very definite connection with the theatre and with people. And one hopes, and I think it's borne out by fact, that this introduced people to the theatre that they then returned to as slightly older children, to pantomimes, and into adulthood to other shows. Their introduction to the theatre was Jack Mays and the Saturday Morning Club and Hairy Harry the Vent Act, and it's a very important part of what went on. The production of our own shows, which would have been inconceivable in the early days, but by the mid-90s, the fact that we were producing our own full-on shows and employing actors and actresses, employing professional directors as a theatre, as opposed to just taking in touring work, we were employing people and putting on shows. That was a really exciting time to do, and probably the one thing I'd pick out that remains with me from that era is when we produced the stage version of Titanic, the musical, the Craig, in 2004, I think it was, is that we actually got a review in the Sunday newspapers by Ed Shenton, is it? It's the professional theatre critic anyway, and he came to see the show, and we got a 5-star review in a national newspaper for a locally produced musical. I think it's hugely important that these records are kept, and obviously certainly more from the past maybe than now in terms of marketing, because everything was on paper, everything was paper brochures, everything was posters and so on. There was no other archive on record of that material, so a lot of it will be finding its way, if you like, into a permanent digital record for the very first time, and it's very important. It could so easily be lost, and it's a bit like our organ from 1932 that was languishing, as I said, in a what was little more than a shed in Stockfold, was then beautifully restored and brought into the Gordon Craig Theatre. Wonderful piece of tradition and history that wasn't lost, and that just could happen to everything that has taken place at the Gordon Craig Theatre. I think it's really important that a lot of people's lives were affected by that, or are still being affected. Shows they first saw, things they came to do, kids who went on stage as juveniles in pantomime, I know for a fact that there are some on stage now in the West End as I speak. There are kids who've been on that stage who are performing today who may well not have done. So the fact that there's records of what the theatre's done over the years for and within the community, I think is a very important aspect, and hopefully it will continue. And as the theatre continues, that the archive is continuously updated in a way that means the records are kept complete.